This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kicking off today's show is Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center with a Cattle Market Outlook. He recaps the market as well as provides an update on retail meat prices and imports from Mexico. K-State Outreach Specialist in Grain Storage and Feed Manufacturing at the IGP Institute, Carlos Campabadal, continues the show as he talks about grain bin safety and shares reminders for farmers and operations. Tina Sullivan, K-State Northeast Area Agronomist, wraps up today's show as she shares tips for growers who want to establish native grasses. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update from the Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Tyler, kicking off our conversation with the cattle market recap.
Yeah, so kind of starting off with some of that recap here, looking at specifically at the Dodge City, Kansas prices there for feeder cattle. Looking at steers specifically on the weight breakdown here. By and large, saw a little bit lower prices here this last week. 5 to 6 weights were about $3.43. That's down about 2.5%, over $8, almost $9. 6 to 7 weights were $3.13. That's actually down about 3%, or about $9 from the prior week. 7 to 8 weights were $2.78. That's down almost $3, about 1% from the prior week. 8 to 9 weights $2.67. That's down about 2.5%. Or about $7 from a week ago. And then those 900 to 1,000 pound steers were $2.44. That's actually a pretty good drop there, about $15, almost 6% from last week. But I think we look at those feeder cattle prices compared to a year ago, we're looking at some pretty strong gains compared to a year ago, over upwards of $30, almost $40 compared to a year ago. So that's about 16 to almost 17% increase. Looking on the heifer side, the weight breakdowns there, 5 to 6 weights were $300. That's down about 6%. 6 to 7 weights were $275.50. That's down less than 1% from last week. 7 to 8 weights were $255, $256 roughly. That's slightly below where it was last week. 8 to 9 weights for heifers were $231. That's down about $6 from the prior week, but still compared to a year ago, seeing some pretty strong gains there on those feeder heifer prices there. Switching over to the fed side of things, 5 area prices last week for on a live basis, steers were $207, heifers were $206, almost $207. That's down about $2.50 from the prior week, but we're sitting up about $25, almost $26 compared to the same week a year ago. On a dress basis, steers and heifers, they're sitting about $327 roughly on a dress basis there. That's down marginally, less than 1% from the prior week. But compared to a year ago, that's up about $40. So some pretty strong gains there in the fed market. I think I'll just note on kind of the cattle prices over this last week. They're down a little bit, but I think we have to keep in mind the bigger scope of here, how things have started since the start of the year. Very strong start to these cattle prices. And so, we're seeing a little bit of a breather in the market here probably this last week. So still an item to watch here, but still some very, very good prices here for this cattle market. Switching over here to the box beef price, specifically looking at choice box beef prices. Cutout value this last week was $320, almost $321. That's down about $6 from the prior week. A lot of the pressure in just the lower cutout value is kind of across the board there. The rib, chuck, round, and loin, brisket were all down from a year ago. Even the flank was down, but the short plate was really the only one that showed pretty much even with the prior week. But by and large, we're still seeing the cutout value hold very strong compared to a year ago, up $26 to almost $27 compared to a year ago. So still a very strong cutout value there for box beef. Still signaling a lot of demand just at the wholesale level for beef. So very a strong positive here for the cattle and beef market as we start 2025.
What are we seeing for retail meat prices?
Yeah, good question. So we've had some data that just came out as far as retail prices go. So specifically looking here at kind of the BLS reported prices, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then USDA ERS, Economic Research Service, reports those prices. So kind of breaking down some of that discussion here, looking on the beef side of things. So the retail beef price in January was reported at $8.53 per pound. That's actually an increase of about 5.5% from last year, and actually the highest on record. So we actually saw a record retail beef price in January. Also want to note, USDA also reports an all fresh retail beef price, which was actually $8.15 per pound, $8.15. That's an increase of just over 4% from last year. January's all fresh retail beef price ranks within the top 5 highest monthly prices reported by USDA ERS. Now, a quick note on the 2 retail beef prices from USDA. USDA defines the retail beef price as the average retail prices for the selected product as reported by BLS, where USDA defines the all fresh retail beef price as the composite value based on choice beef, other beef, and hamburger retail prices developed to estimate the average retail value of total beef production. So the main takeaway from this is that each retail beef price aggregates individual beef cuts data slightly differently. Regardless, both retail beef prices are indicating rising beef prices at the retail level. So looking a little bit more at some of these beef prices, ground beef was actually $5.82 per pound in January. That's up just over 6% from last year. Roast increased 6% from last year to $7.72 per pound in January, and steaks actually rose almost 3% in January to $11.79, so almost that $12 mark for steaks there. So overall on the beef side, the start to 2025 retail beef prices have held strong in January, which follows the trend that was quite frankly started in the fourth quarter of 2024. Now, switching over to the pork side of things, in January, the retail pork price was $4.95 per pound, which was an increase of just over 3% from last year. Looking a little bit more of some of those retail pork prices, bacon was actually $7.04 per pound in January. That's up almost 7% from the previous year. And actually, the last time bacon was above $7 per pound was October of 2023, when it was $7.22 per pound. Pork chops in January increased marginally less than 1% from the prior year to $4.25 per pound in January. Hams were $4.41 per pound in January, which was even with last year's price. So main takeaway on the pork side of things, retail pork prices continue to hold just below $5, kind of that $5 mark there. So as we get into 2025 here, an item to watch will be to see if those retail pork prices crest that $5 per pound mark. The last time retail pork prices were above $5 per pound was October of 2023. Then that was $5.04 per pound. Now moving over to some discussion on retail prices for chicken. A couple of things to note there on the January whole bird chicken price was $2.06 per pound, which was unchanged from December of 2024, but compared to a year ago is actually up almost 4%. USDA also reports a composite retail chicken price, which increased fractionally from last year by less than 1% to $2.43 per pound. And a quick note on the composite retail chicken price, USDA defines this as the retail value of the composite wholesale value for broilers. So it's an aggregate of wholesale chicken cuts to get a representative retail price. So overall retail prices for both beef, pork, and chicken appear to be continuing to hold strong going into 2025, which follows a trend in relative stronger prices that started in 2024. The looming concern, though, as we start 2025, is turning more towards just meat demand at these, as I'd indicated, record beef prices. And so, consumers' appetite and willingness to pay at these prices is a looming concern as we start 2025 here. And so kind of on that meat demand discussion there, we kind of have some of the finalized data for 2024 to kind of give us an indication as far as overall demand and kind of that picture that shaped up in 2024. So a quick takeaways here, beef demand, based on some of the matrices and statistics that we look at, beef demand fared well in 2024 despite the higher retail prices. On the pork side, pork demand, relative demand profile for pork held steady, with last year tracking closely with what was seen in 2023. On the chicken side, generally speaking, chicken demand at the retail level was stronger as it is a relatively cheaper meat option in the meat case. But I think we also have to keep in mind that January and February, as we start 2025 here, these tend to be some of the weaker demand months in the year for meat, largely because we're in the middle of winter, so people are inside more and there is less outdoor grilling. As we get into more of the springtime, typically we'll start to see just demand for meat increase as people are outside enjoying the nicer weather. And so that kind of starts the grilling season, which is kind of unofficially around that Memorial Day timeframe there. So kind of one of those things we're looking at from just an overall demand picture for meat as we move into 2025 here.
And Tyler, while you're on, also want to give us a quick update on what cattle imports from Mexico are doing right now.
Yeah, so back in November, if you may recall, there was a reported case of New World screwworm in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. That was in late November there, and USDA suspended the imports of cattle and bison from Mexico at that time. And since then, we have not seen any cattle or any livestock imports from Mexico. Now, there has been new protocol that has been put in place and agreed upon between both Mexico and the U.S. to ensure the protection of U.S. cattle and livestock. One quick note, as a part of this new protocol that was signed between the two countries, Mexico identified and prepared pre-export inspection pens on the Mexican side of the border. APHIS has visited, inspected, and improved these facilities. And so now we're starting to see cattle move through these pre-export inspection pens. USDA reported last week that actually 1,400 head of cattle were imported from Mexico. So this actually marks the first reported importation of cattle from Mexico since the mid-November detection of New World screwworm and USDA closed the border there. Now moving forward, it's likely that cattle imports from Mexico will be slow as the new protocol between the U.S. and Mexico still gets a little bit more implemented there. So there's still going to be a throttled effect of the flow of cattle here for a bit here until they get some of this stuff sorted out here. But overall, this is still a very fluid situation that will likely continue to evolve as the U.S. and Mexico work through the protocol and ensure the safety of U.S. cattle supplies.
Tyler, thank you for taking the time to join us once again and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after the break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about grain bin safety as this is Grain Bin Safety Week. And then to talk about grain bin safety, we're joined by outreach specialist in grain storage and feed manufacturing at the IGP Institute at K-State, Carlos Campabadal. Carlos, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby. It's always a pleasure to be part of this and always talk about one of the topics that I really enjoy, and I think is very important, safety overall, and of course, focus today on grain bin safety.
An important aspect of it, not even thinking about the bin, but the quality of grain that's going into it.
Yes, and that's something very important to talk about, both at the commercial and the farm level. One of the things that the studies have been done, and Purdue University had done some for many years, keeping record of this, but there's a direct relationship that when there's issue in terms of quality inside a grain bin, spoilage that comes with bad odors, there's a relationship that there's more issues in terms of safety, more injuries, people getting stuck in the grain, all those things because people tend to go in to check it out. And then they happen all the different issues that we could talk about that we, of course, try to avoid by having or performing good grain storage practices that can help you maintain the quality as the best as you can.
What are some of those good grain storage practices?
Well, mainly, talking about both at the farmer and the commercial level, there's different things that you could do. And of course, the first thing that is very important in a grain bin is to have a temperature cable. A temperature cable is a tool that could tell you if there's an increase in temperature in the grain. And when that happens, of course, they're just a little bit and in a gradual way that just could be the outside temperatures during the hot weather season that just increase it. But you start getting spikes, and a rapid increase could be either insect infestation, and one of the worst things that could happen, of course, is mold growth. Mold releases heat, and when mold growth gets the grain compacted, it could get at the surface of the grain mass can be encrusted, and of course produce bad odors, and of course mycotoxins that can be an issue for animal and human safety when that grain is consumed. So temperature cables will be number one thing that I will look into it. There's new technologies out there like monitoring CO2, carbon dioxide that is also produced by mold and insects. So there's some tools there, but knowing the temperature of grain, taking sample, inspecting can tell you there's an issue. So to overcome that, of course, try to always have your grain bin well maintained with no leaks of water. doing aeration, to turn on your fans pretty much to cool down that grain, to keep it as cold as possible. And of course, moving the grain if you cannot do aeration, all those things that can help you have a better storability of it to avoid any potential issues in quality that can later, trigger other issues later on in terms of safety.
If there is unfortunately an issue with quality and the producer or employee has to get in, what are a few really important safety tips?
I have to say that, first of all, one of the things that we try to tell either a producer, farmer, or anybody in the commercial employee, just try not to go inside a grain bin. OSHA regulates that very well for the commercial sides, and the farmer, not that much. But what is important is that if you have to go in, that we try to the people not to do it, always do different procedures for safety. First of all, lockout tag. What does that mean? Well, first of all, go in and shut down any equipment that could move grain in, move grain out, any moving part of equipment by putting a lock, putting a tag. And that's very standard procedure in the industry. And the farm level, some people, of course, do it, but we really like to suggest people to do it as much as can and lock it. So nobody by mistake can turn it on, and that could cause somebody to get trapped or grain to fall on top of it. Then the other thing, of course, that we always tell anybody is to have a spotter. What does that mean? Never go in by yourself. Always have somebody watching you, have radio communication if possible, or cell phone in case something happened, have enough light, because inside a grain bin is dark, and it's actually rated a confined space in many ways. So we want to avoid that. But don't having a spotter, and then of course, if you feel there's a risk, never go in. And I actually suggest only go inside a grain bin in the commercial side when the grain bin is at the lower level of being full, in case you have to go in to take out a temperature cable and just to move the grain in. So those are the key things that are always very, very important. If grain is spoiled, there's bad odors inside a grain bin, the atmosphere can change. There could be mold spores up in the air that could be modified atmosphere, and it could be some hazard in terms of respiration. I had it. Some people call that a farmer's fever, but I would suggest people to just go in with a mask to avoid any potential issues, especially if there's a lot of dust inside that environment.
If something does happen, what is the first thing that someone should do?
First thing that I would say, if you get trapped in grain, don't panic. That's the first thing. And the other thing is to call 911. That will be the first thing. The first responders, fire departments around, especially in rural areas, they usually are very well trained on how to rescue people that get trapped in a grain bin. Because when you get trapped in grain above your waist, people cannot pull you out. They could actually rip you apart. So the best way to rescue somebody that's been trapped in grain is to isolate that person, but put in some sort of separation. And there's equipment out there called rescue tubes that some companies sell. But it pretty much isolates the person so you could actually dig out the corn so it goes below all the way to the knees of that person and pull it out. Because if you don't isolate that person, then as soon as you pull that grain from one side, it will cover. You know how it is inside a grain mass. That is like being dug in sand. You dig one side or shovel it out, and then sand comes in the other way. So those are the typical things that we suggest. Never pull somebody that the grain covering more than half above its waist. That's one of the simple rules it is. And then of course, don't panic. And when somebody comes to rescue you, never unload grain. And if they make a hole in one of the sides of the grain bin walls, it has to be done in a symmetrical way. What I'm trying to say is that you don't never want to pull grain from one side, because then structurally there's going to be more grain in the other, and that could cause failure, especially in smaller grain bins, and if they haven't been well maintained too.
What are a few things that producers, companies need to do to their bins to keep them safe?
Well, one key thing is to always keep an eye on it, do the maintenance, check for missing bolts, always load grain from the center part of it, and always unload it from the bottom loading parts. If you have a hopper bottom or a flat bottom, always there. Never to the sides. And if you're doing from the sides, like some old elevators will have them, it has to be unloading in an even way to avoid any potential structural issue because grain leaning on one wall and not on that. Keep in mind that metal grain bins, they are designed to hold the grain, but not a lot of force. Concrete they could hold, of course, because it's a different type of structural design. But for farmers, I'll tell them keep an eye on it, do the maintenance, check for any type of holes, bolts missing, corrosion, water accumulation, because that could damage the grain bin. So it's very important to do that.
Carlos, as we think about grain bin safety and wrap up our conversation, what are the few key points you'd really like our listeners to keep in mind? Always
try not to enter a grain bin. That's kind of like my overall suggestion. Of course, I understand that some people might need to go in for reasons, but if you do that, lockout, tag out, always have a spotter, have enough light, open any doors, any manholes to let air in, wear a mask, and of course, always check the quality of your grain to avoid any spoilage that especially when people go in to check it out, try to avoid that. So safety should be the number one job of anybody, either at the commercial facility or at a farm. We always want to be in the best health position, avoid any type of injury. And that is always very important. And something to keep in mind on grain bin safety is that usually when we talk about grain dust explosions, they occur more on bucket elevators and especially more in facilities than at the farm level, but they could also happen. So keep in mind that those things are very important to keep an eye on. There's a lot of research out there and information by many universities on extension publications and videos on YouTube and other outlets that could tell you about grain bin safety.
Carlos, is there a favorite resource you have for people if they do want to learn more about grain bin safety?
NGFA, National Grain Feed Association, which is one of our partners at IGP, has a lot of information on it. Jeeps, the Grain Elevator and Processing Society, another of IGP's partners, they also have information. Also, I do believe that some universities have a very strong safety. I think Oklahoma State has a very good information in terms of how to rescue people that are entrapped in grain. So I will look around those resources.
That was outreach specialist in grain storage and feed manufacturing at the IGP Institute at K-State, Carlos Campabadal. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Stick around because we're cutting to a short break, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about establishing native grasses with K-State Northeast Area agronomist Tina Sullivan. Tina, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tina, why is establishment something that's really important for native grasses?
When we think about any of our grasses, whether they're native or some of our cool seasons, establishment is really that key period where we want to give those seedlings the best of the best soil preparation, fertility, and weed management, because if we don't give them the best of the best when, per se, they're babies, we can't expect them to be productive adults. So just as we really, want to baby children when they're young or animals when they're young, we want to do the same thing with our pastures, but especially with native pastures, just because their seed bank, the seeds themselves are smaller. They don't have as much food storage in them. So if they really have to compete or they have more of a poor soil condition, they're just not going to be able to flourish and become a productive stand.
What is some of the preparation that growers, if they're establishing native grass, should take care of?
When it comes to seedbed preparation, we say a firm, weed-free seedbed is recommended. So we want it to be as weed-free as possible. If we do have weeds already establishing, they're going to outcompete that native grass right off the bat. We want it to be what we say firm is so there's good seed to soil contact, because again, these are very small seeds that don't have a lot of food storage, so they've really got to get germinated and get going and get that root into the soil profile the best it can.
What is the seeding rate for native grasses commonly?
So for seeding rate, it's going to kind of be dependent on what that mix is. For some of them, it's 5 to 10 pounds. Some of them, it's as low as 2 pounds per acre. It really does depend on what you want in that mix and the purity of that seed. Looking at the publication MF2291 really will step you through how to see what you want in your mix and how to calculate that pure live seed to see how many pounds per acre you need for your native establishment.
And when growers are going through this, sometimes they need to include some fertilization in their plan?
So for fertilization, a lot of our research here at K-State shows that fertility needs might not be what we think they need to be for a native stand, but we need to focus on pH. So changing your soil pH before you establish native grasses is important. So if that pH is below 6 when you do a soil test, that's when we suggest applying lime. And the application of lime is going to be dependent on what your pH is and your soil type. So referring to your soil test is what's going to be best for you.
How long does it commonly take this actually to establish?
So just because of how native grasses are, to become a fully established stand, they can take up to 4 years. So really working at the beginning to make sure everything is as perfect as we can get to be can ensure we have that very well-established stand. Because again, it does take time for it to become productive.
If this is something growers are planning on doing on their operation, when should they plant?
So for planting, the state's kind of split into 3 zones for native grasses, and this is this table and map is found in our agronomy e-update that we published. So for zone 1, which is kind of southeast area of the state, our optimum range is March 25th to April 10th. Acceptable range would be February 15th to May 1st. For zone 2, which really covers everywhere from south central Kansas up to the northeast, our optimum range is April 1st to April 20th, with acceptable range of March 1st to May 15th. And then zone 3, which is our northwest corridor of the state, would be April 10th to April 30th being optimum, but March 1st through May 15th being an acceptable range.
Tina, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me again.
That was K-State Northeast Area Agronomist Tina Sullivan. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link the Agronomy e-update article as well as the bookstore publication. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.